Hello, welcome everybody. I'm Alexander Siedschlag, the Dean of the Embry-Riddle Worldwide College of Arts and Sciences. I'm your host today for another occurrence of Resilience Reimagined, the Dean's Virtual Speaker Series. We invite you once a month to join us and our esteemed guests to discuss fresh perspectives on a broad range of topics from a variety of fields and sectors within the vision of achieving whole community resilience locally, nationally, internationally, and globally. This Dean's Virtual Speaker Series also contributes to fostering the vision of the Embry-Riddle Worldwide College of Arts and Sciences, which is to be a destination college for multidisciplinary studies and impactful collaborative research, as well as continue to be a national leader in general education, developing opportunities for our diverse student population to fulfill their educational goals and become responsible global citizens as well. Resilience Reimagined is very tightly connected to our social media motto that you can see here behind me. And that is for our college to foster innovative education and research to foster positive change around the world. Now we have a speaker today who is a scholar who has crossed boundaries and also pushed boundaries in her field, Jan Classen, postdoctoral fellow in the Building a Culture of Resilience Lab at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. And her topic today is School Leadership as Boundary Spanning in Community Crisis Resilience. Jan is a postdoctoral fellow, like I said, in the Building a Culture of Resilience Lab at Dalhousie. She has a PhD in Learning, Design, and Technology with the graduate minor in Education Policy and Leadership from the Pennsylvania State University, otherwise known as Penn State. She researches school and community crisis leadership and resilience. Jen has served as a consultant on school safety and emergency management education grants, as well as been awarded the Laurel Award for outstanding service and the Ralph T. Heimer Award during her time at the Pennsylvania State University. Prior to starting her PhD, Jen was a high school math and computer science teacher and an instructional technology coach for a school district in Washington State. So Jen brings a lot of experience to the table from the practitioner and from the researcher side. And it's also nice to, as always, to see an alumni from my previous institution back. So, and like I said before, when we were discussing the opening, like I said before, even if one transitions institutions, it's really also resilience is also about network building, right? And then have actionable networks. And why would you burn all the bridges as you transition? It's important to maintain the bridges and then to also cross-fertilize scholarship in the still evolving field of homeland security that is now 20, 24, 23 years old, but approaching a quarter of a century of age. So now with that, without further ado, Jen, can I ask you to take it away? Once again, a warm welcome to everybody who's been joining here, and very much looking forward. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Siedschlag. I really appreciate the very warm welcome and opening. The conversation about relationships and networks is really resonant to me, and spoiler alert, I'm going to talk about it a lot in my presentation. So let me share my screen. And I'm going to ask the obligatory question of, can you all see my screen and not my presenter notes? Great. Okay. So thank you all for inviting me to speak today on my research regarding school crisis leadership and resilience. I'm not going to introduce myself again because Dr. Siedschlag did such an incredible job. But so the focus of my talk today will be on school leadership as boundary spanning in community crisis resilience. Some of what I will talk about today comes from my research at Penn State and my current projects here at Dalhousie University alongside real events and related scholarship. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to post them in the chat and I will answer them at the end. Before I begin, it's important to recognize and pay respect to the First Peoples on whose territories I live, work, and study. Dalhousie University operates in the unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq peoples. These peoples hold inherent rights as the original peoples of these lands, and we each carry collective obligations under the peace and friendship treaties. Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982 recognizes and affirms Aboriginal and treaty rights in Canada. I also want to recognize that African Nova Scotians are a distinct people whose histories, legacies, and contributions have enriched that part of Mi'kma'ki known as Nova Scotia for over 400 years. The objective for today's talk is to analyze the boundary-spanning work of school leaders during community crisis, particularly as a part of holistic community resilience. Throughout this talk, I'll discuss both the theoretical and practical side of boundary spanning. Theoretically, boundary spanning is productive for examining how school leaders cross fields of work. Boundary spanning also is a practical function of building community resilience to crisis through preparedness, response, and recovery. So first, I'll define boundary spanning as a theoretical concept in organizational theory and educational leadership literature. In addition, I'll discuss the intersections of boundary spanning and school crisis leadership. Then I'll talk about schools as resilience anchors in communities, which come to life during crises, and is important for contextualizing the boundary spanning work of school leaders during a community crisis. Third, I'll use 4 cases to highlight and provide insight into boundary spanning work during school crisis leadership. These cases come from community disasters in the US, New Zealand, Japan, and Canada. Then I'll conclude with discussing barriers, strategies, and implications related to school crises, boundary spanning, and leadership, including research, policy, and practice. The theoretical concept of boundary spanning is defined as connecting between and across multiple fields of work and is rooted in organizational theory literature. Sometimes boundary spanning is between 2 organizations or agencies. Sometimes this is more abstract, like interdisciplinary research. The idea of boundary spanning is crossing boundaries between 2 entities for some sort of shared or collaborative work and learning. Boundary spanners, sometimes referred to as brokers in the literature, quote, bring language, ideas, and norms of diverse communities into conversation with each other. Ultimately, boundary spanners bridge organizations and their environments, sharing critical information, coordinating resources, and building trust. Boundary spanning is an essential element of crisis preparedness, response, and recovery. Crises intensify interdependence and coordinating across boundaries, from infrastructure to public health, and of course, schools. Leaders who span boundaries reduce delay and align action for resources to use during that crisis. Furthermore, with stronger and wider boundary spanning, leaders can foster complex networked adaptations. These networks can then be dynamically activated as needed, depending on the size and scope of the crisis at hand. Moreover, the most effective leadership during a crisis actually occurs when leaders have preemptively built and planned cross-boundary relationships before any crisis happens. From a theoretical understanding, boundary spanning has significant implications for practicing community and school leaders during times of crisis. Therefore, it's important to understand school crisis leadership literature and how these 2 theories inform each other. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, school crisis leadership literature was a growing field in educational leadership. Where boundary spanning is abstract to leadership in crises, school crisis leadership is narrow in its scope and orientations. School crisis leadership theory, similar to boundary spanning, has deep implications for the practical work of leading a school during a crisis. Just as in boundary spanning, school leaders must foster collaborations both internally and externally. However, this should be done as a part of nurturing a learning community. More than just access to and adaptively using resources, a learning community promotes expertise sharing, but also understanding that there will be challenges and hiccups along the way, where all school community members have the self-efficacy and partnerships to learn from and adapt to these challenges. As such, school crisis leadership is about facilitating a culture of learning across the whole of the school community through purposeful leadership. This can create a conflict where leaders must support innovation while preserving the existing culture for a semblance of stability. Crises require us to do something different than our everyday activities. Leaders then help facilitate and give sense to the primary purposes, norms, and values of the community during that situation. As such, this requires school leaders to both be hopeful and promote hope across their school and district. This hopeful, future-oriented leadership that balances preserving culture with innovation within a collaborative learning community is one of the core challenges of leading a school during a crisis. In educational literature, school crisis leadership theory interweaves with other educational leadership theories. Both within an organization and spanning boundaries, there are many formal and informal leaders that take up leadership work, as described in the theory of distributed leadership. During a crisis, decisions must be made, whether or not a person is a titled leader, like school principal or superintendent. Because of the need for preemptive planning and relationship building, the capacity for an organization to respond to and recover from unexpected challenges and crises defines their overall organizational resilience. As such, crisis leadership often goes hand in hand with the capacity of a school or district at large for dynamically responding to and bouncing back from unexpected challenges, whether they be a natural disaster or an instructional emergency, like school and improvement. Moreover, the practices of how an organization learns and changes informs both the immediate crisis response as well as the long-term recovery and adaptation. Research from COVID-19 on schools indicates that those that were best able to quickly learn, pivot, and keep learning were those who best moved through shutdowns, hybrid schooling schedules, and full reopenings. So, bringing it all together, boundary spanning and school crisis leadership are both informative about and generative for examining the role of schools and school leadership during community crisis events as a part of holistic resilience. Both of them highlight the deep collaborative work of formal and informal leaders across different fields. Both are dependent on strong, trusting relationships. Both require sharing meaning making and goal setting for that collaborative work. Both facilitate adaptive resource identification and use. And in the context of crises, both build on preemptive planning and preparedness. But what does this look like in action? I'm going to briefly illustrate school boundary spanning in the preparedness and response stages of crises before coming back to the theory again for a bit. The left villa from Grauvila's 2024 article depicts how elders and community members supported school-based disaster education programs for students on earthquake preparedness in the Tohoku region of Japan. This education training experience involved presidents of the local women's association and other community elders. In the right figure, this evacuation drill for a bomb threat at a school in South Korea included the local police. In both of these situations, boundary spanning between schools and different community groups occurred because of the shared community need to preemptively build crisis resilience capacity. This required the school leaders to facilitate bringing these community groups together, supporting sharing meaning making across their organization, including staff and students, and coordinating resources like time and space for these events to occur. The field of schools and schooling revolves around education and child and adolescent development. However, in knowing that schools also play a pivotal role in community crises, the work of schools intersects with the work of crises at these boundary spanning moments of educational and preparedness experiences. Furthermore, during COVID, we saw schools become community distribution hubs of food, technology, testing, and even vaccines. In this image, King County Parks and Highline schools built on their already existing partnership to continue and expand their summer food distribution program. I personally watched this happen in the school district where I was an instructional technology coach in the South Puget Sound area in spring 2020. More than just providing resources, schools exist as a place and a symbol for supporting that capacity and overall resilience. Not only did the fields of schooling and public health intersect, but the third field of social services also came into play during the response efforts to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so focusing on the role of schools and communities, schools are anchors as often trusted and accessible institutions. When people think of a community, there is typically some sort of school or educational center within that understanding. During crises, they serve as both a physical and a symbolic hub of response, recovery, and resilience. Schools are often used as a measure of whole community crisis resilience capacity. As such, school leaders help to maintain stability and community morale during a crisis through empathetic, forward-leaning communications, resourcefully keeping open or reopening schools, sometimes in new locations, and partnering to be distribution hubs like during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so in terms of being a community anchor, the socio-political context of a school or a district is just as important as the community's social characteristics and dynamics for understanding the kinds of boundaries that are spanned by school leaders. In some places like the US, school governance is a parallel government structure to the local municipal and county governments. I use the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to illustrate this point. First, at the smallest unit in this map are school districts, of which there are 500 in Pennsylvania and shown using the black lines. By state educational law, every school entity in Pennsylvania is required to have a safety and security coordinator. This means for every district, in addition to every private and charter school as well. This individual is supposed to be a liaison between the school and their local first responders. So the middle-sized unit depicted by the dotted lines are the counties. Most of the counties encompass multiple school districts, which you can see on the map. And so the county-level emergency responders will need to coordinate with multiple school safety and security coordinators, each of which may determine varying needs and goals related to the preparedness practices based on their own infrastructure, financial resources, social dynamics, and more. School leaders reciprocally will likely only collaborate with one county official while knowing that if an emergency like a school shooting occurs, all neighboring responders, no matter the jurisdiction, will immediately deploy to that school. So the largest unit in the map are intermediate units, shown by the different colors. These 29 organizations are regional educational service agencies that often serve as a middle-level support between school districts and the state-level Department of Education. Like each school district, each IU is also required to have their own safety and security coordinator, many of whom help to mediate the district coordinators with their county and state first responders. Practically speaking, we can see the socio-political boundaries that school leaders then must span during crisis response between districts, counties, and IUs. Theoretically, this could look like operationalized formal agreements such as MOUs or regularly occurring meetings. This means that across the state of Pennsylvania, there are multiple pockets of collaboration where different shared understandings, goals, and purposes have developed over years of collaborative work. Unfortunately, this also means that there are pockets where this boundary spanning work has not occurred to the same depth for a multitude of reasons. So to summarize, boundary spanning tunes us to examining how different fields of work are brought together and bridged. This can be abstract, like fields of emergency management and schooling. This can also be more tangible, like organizational or jurisdictional boundaries. Leading a school during crises requires boundary spanning across many different kinds of boundaries. In order to be proactively prepared, school leaders must build these relationships outside of their organizations, but also internal ones. These relationships include deep trust and a shared meaning making and understanding of how to respond to crises involving schools, and also the primary role of the schools in the community-wide events. Ultimately, in looking at the theories of boundary spanning and school crisis leadership, the practical implications for both theories are entangled and inform each other due to their similarities. Lastly, schools exist as physical and symbolic community anchors for short and long-term resilience. As such, school leadership is an important linchpin in the overall boundary spanning work to cultivate community resilience. I've talked quite a bit about the theory, and so now I'm going to show what this looks like. I'll discuss 4 cases of community crises where school leaders engaged in boundary spanning as a part of their response leadership. Specifically, I'll draw on the examples of Hurricane Katrina in the US, the Christchurch earthquake in New Zealand, the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami in Japan, and the mass wildfires in Canada. Across these examples, I'll highlight school leader boundary spanning activities for resources, partners, and practices for leading schools during and after the different crises. After passing over South Florida, Hurricane Katrina made landfall in Louisiana on August 29, 2005. The storm led to the massive failures of the city floodwalls and subsequent flooding of over 80% of the neighborhoods. About 100 of the 128 public schools were destroyed or rendered unusable at the beginning of that school year. The failures of crisis response ultimately led to an overhauling of the national emergency response efforts. Even before Hurricane Katrina hit, some schools were more than 100 years old and in need of significant maintenance and refurbishment. According to Jimmy Fernholz, a member of the New Orleans School Board, in an interview with PBS, there were, quote, probably 50 to 60 schools that should have been torn down, end quote, before Katrina even hit. Furthermore, in recovering after the hurricane, New Orleans School Parish was significantly redesigned, leading to an explosion of charter schools. In 2019, all of the New Orleans Parish public schools were operated by charter management organizations. The first district-run school since Katrina was opened in 2024. Immediately after Katrina, student enrollment plummeted in the New Orleans School Parish and still has not yet reached the same numbers. As we know from disaster migration research and as represented in this graph, families often do not go back to the towns and communities they left because of the devastation from a disaster. My mother was a classroom teacher, and she had given me a lot of things, just memories that you just can't get back. My mother was a little bit of an artist, so she drew a lot of the storybook characters for me. My dad also gave me a cassette tape with the song Knowledge is Power that I used to play for my kids. I lost the tape that he had given me, so sentimental things. Everybody in the city lost a lot. Michelle Garnett was an early career teacher when Katrina hit. She, like many other teachers, came from a teaching family. In addition to losing the physical school members also lost mementos from across their and their family members' teaching careers. These sentimental aspects tie into the symbolic representation of schools in people's lives and communities. While school leaders can prioritize rebuilding physical schools, as was done after Katrina, the sentimental losses cannot be replaced. Instead, from crisis leadership literature, leaders must lean into empathy and socio-emotional supports for recognizing these losses that occur because of crises while concurrently supporting their communities to be hopeful, resilient, and future-oriented. In the same way, we see how leaders must span the boundaries between managerial work and emotional support. In the aftermath of the storm, school leaders engaged in an overwhelming amount of boundary spanning activities related to the several goals of education, advocacy, and support. They had to find temporary classrooms for the destroyed buildings by partnering with NGOs and faith-based organizations. The leaders also partnered with media and other agencies to advocate for the displaced students who were scattered throughout the South and country as a whole. In addition to this, students and families had to be reunified when children were accidentally evacuated from shelters separately from their parents in the disjointed response after the storm. In this way, school leaders looked inwardly to embed student and staff welfare services into schools as a part of the holistic community recovery and resilience. School leaders became community navigators, helping their students, families, and staff to coordinate education, welfare, housing, and other services. All of this while navigating their own professional instability of rapidly opening and closing public and charter schools. On February 22nd, 2011, a major earthquake occurred in Christchurch, New Zealand. The September before, there had already been a major earthquake in Canterbury, leading to this February one being an aftershock. The February earthquake was a 6.3 magnitude that damaged already shaken infrastructure. The Christchurch quake disrupted schooling citywide. Like after Hurricane Katrina, leaders had to rapidly co-manage school capacities, and community needs for ensuring a safe return of students to the shaken schools, even when a significant number of families and children relocated outside the Christchurch area. Pupils at King's High School in Dunedin will forego $13,500 of funds raised for special projects this year and instead give the money to their brothers at Shirley Boys High School in Christchurch. Until the school can be rebuilt, the Shirley Boys will share classrooms with pupils at Papanui High School. Here, Lewis describes the multifaceted ways schools supported each other in the aftermath of the quake. While Shirley students were sharing classrooms at Papanui High, another high school, King's High, stepped in to help support Shirley financially to rebuild their school. While each of these schools are distinctively different organizations, the financial boundaries were spanned in this response to the earthquake. So in the aftermath, school leaders immediately jumped into being crisis responders. Indeed, some school leaders with crisis response training, like paramedicine and search and rescue, were activated and had to delegate school operations to others. Boundary spanning here was about bridging people and systems, for creating shared resources like buildings that were undamaged, maintaining family trust and cohesion, as well as coordinating support services around mental health. When schools were either closed temporarily or permanently, other schools, NGOs, and the Ministry of Education stepped up to support site sharing and facilitate the safe reopening of damaged schools. The Oamaru community, led by Oamaru Intermediate School, is hosting pupils from 4 earthquake-affected Christchurch intermediate schools over the coming weeks. The activities for each week were planned by the teachers of the host classes after their pupils discussed which activities might appeal to their visitors. Not all leadership activities rested solely on school leaders and other educators. Schools outside the Christchurch area even reached out to support students. First through hosting donation drives and then through this student hosting program. Students from these external schools led informal leadership roles by helping to organize and plan the visit of the Christchurch students while their parents and school staff continued to work on their own recovery efforts. Later that same year, the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami occurred. In March, a 9.0 to 9.1 undersea earthquake took place, leading to a subsequent tsunami. In the picture, the water line here is only 4 meters or about 13 feet above the floor, while the tsunami was documented to be between 6 and 8 meters tall, twice the height in the picture. This disaster devastated coastal communities, leading to mass displacement in the short and long term. As a result, schools acted as vital shelters and relief points in communities. Some children have not left the school since the disaster. Instead, their families have moved in. Hokkaido Elementary was used as an evacuation center, like many schools in northeastern Japan. Around 200 people are still living in the classrooms on the third floor. The desks have been cleared away and blankets laid out. Although Hokkaido Elementary was hit by the same earthquake and tsunami, compared to the homes in the community, the school withstood the disaster. By providing space in the school for families to temporarily live, the educators, quote, see their role as providing stability and a return to the old routine, end quote, thereby preserving routines within this new normal. Similarly, coffee tents with psychologists and other services were set up nearby to provide additional supports to students and families. School leaders orchestrated shelter routines, mediated privacy and cultural norms, and integrated emotional support throughout the disaster response. And as I mentioned earlier, the community learning after this disaster led to localized disaster education programs that not only spanned boundaries between fields, but also generations. As a part of their activities, school leaders had to be mindful of both the immediate needs and long-term goals for response and recovery. In the immediacy, people needed a safe place to stay when their homes were damaged or destroyed. Furthermore, leaders liaised with other schools, organizations, and agencies to provide the physical and psychosocial supports for their students, families, staff, and the community at large. In knowing that earthquakes and tsunamis are an ongoing and likely hazard, leaders then work to develop long-term preparedness practices and programs like educational services. For the last case example, I'm going to talk about the wildfires in Canada. Unlike the last three examples, I'm not going to talk about any one wildfire in particular, but them collectively as well as their local effects. As of September 21, there has been an estimated over 5,340 wildfires in Canada in 2025 alone. They span the width and breadth of the country from coast to coast to coast and have covered nearly 21.7 million acres of land and forest. We are still experiencing the effects of one here in West Nova Scotia in Annapolis County, where the remaining evacuees were finally allowed to return just this past weekend. Wildfires cause the destruction of lives, homes, livelihoods, and of course, schools. Moreover, there is often significant and pervasive smoke and low air quality across the country and even continent that affect the learning and growth of children. This reality, like the COVID-19 pandemic, requires persistent and complex school leadership and partnering with public health organizations in order to protect children's developing lungs while maintaining stable and supportive learning environments. Northland School Division says this school year is the second one in a row that more than 24 elementary and high school students from Chipewyan Lake are attending schools in Wabasca, a hamlet located 135 kilometers south of their homes. It's unfortunate to say, but it's almost like they're getting used to this every year, said Cal Johnson, the superintendent, in a phone interview. This fire in Alberta burned an area of over 28,000 square miles. Like the Christchurch earthquake, affected schools partnered with other schools to access temporary space to still have classes. But most noticeably in this quote, the superintendent talks about how the students are almost getting used to this every year. As schools cross jurisdictional boundaries with other schools, what does that mean when the reality of these boundaries are regularly blurred? Do these schools share curriculum and teaching standards? What about assessments or student data? Or shared MOUs and response practices, such as student-family reunification plans? This new reality requires new kinds of shared decision and procedure making that cross these jurisdictional boundaries. For wildfires and their subsequent smoke, schooling also intersects with public health. With the pervasive wildfire smoke affecting the entire country and continent, resources have been created to help support schools to operate safely. This particular guidance, provided by the Simcoe Muskoka District Health Unit in Ontario, provides additional guidance on what kinds of people are more at risk, what are common and uncommon symptoms of wildfire smoke exposure, and what kinds of indoor and outdoor activities schools should or shouldn't do to best protect students. Like during the pandemic, schools partner with public health offices for making these decisions. Noticeably, the Simcoe-Muskoka guidance was, quote, adapted with permissions from the Vancouver Coastal Health. As such, we see how these multifaceted boundary spanning between the fields of work, of education, and public health, but also the jurisdictional boundaries between the two different health organizations as well. In times of emergency, schools are among the first community supports mobilized, from offering up buildings capable of large gatherings to loaning school bus fleets for rapid evacuation, said Alan Campbell, president of the Canadian School Boards Association. Campbell noted that local school divisions and the province are maintaining contact with wildfire evacuees still living in hotels a week ahead of the new term to connect them with nearby public schools their kids can attend in the meantime. Here, schools act as resources and anchors in their community, between providing the literal resource of school buses to the social capacity and relational resource of connecting displaced families with their new local school. We see multiple boundary spanning layers that all come to life during the wildfire response. However, by supporting the students in enrolling in other schools, those enrollment counts and attached funding is then decreased for that original school. And so school leaders navigate doing what's best for students and families and the financial repercussions of that support. In spanning boundaries, school leaders navigate and develop shared goals for complex crisis response work. The decisions that are made have multifaceted effects. It was for the best for students and families to become connected to their new local school. However, the ramification means less funding based on enrollment for the old school to rebuild and recover. Across these four examples, we saw many practical ways in which boundary spanning and school crisis response occurred. Schools acted as a community resource, such as a shelter. School leaders collaborated across schools and districts to access temporary teaching and learning spaces. Additionally, in collaborating with other agencies like the Ministry of Education, local welfare, and public health, leaders brought in needed resources and services directly to students, such as socio-emotional services. This required centering the needs and values of the diverse community groups into the response efforts. School leaders also looked to the future and how to collaborate with other community groups to be proactive through disaster education and crisis planning. Lastly, school leaders, as a part of their boundary spanning work, balance complex decisions with multifaceted outcomes. Through a boundary spanning lens, we see how these activities and practices of school leaders require and connect into other organizations as a part of whole community resilience. Across the fields of work, these four examples also highlight the various fields school leaders span as a part of their response and recovery, such as crisis management, public health, social welfare, and more. Some fields of work school leaders were already likely spanning, such as construction and civil engineering, information technology, and community development. The boundary spanning work involved creating a shared understanding of their collaborative action for a common goal, often in the response and recovery stages of the community disasters. Boundary spanning tunes us to the theoretical contours of how this collaborative work by formal and informal leaders can create both organic, just-in-time collaborative practices, but also the ways in which formal collaboration may be infrastructured into cross-field routines as a part of cultivating holistic community resilience. While I have discussed both the theoretical and practical nature of boundary spanning, I'm sure many of us are also thinking about the barriers to it as well. One of the forefront is bureaucratic silos and unclear mandates. Although Pennsylvania requires each school and security coordinator to liaise with local first responders, there's no clear definition about what that means for the leaders who don't have a crisis response background. I also go back to my earlier comment about the response efforts to Hurricane Katrina. Disconnected agencies supporting shelters led to some students and families being evacuated separately to different states. I use this as an example of how even the same information can be siloed between agencies, which boundary spanners must contend with. In the US context, the separation between school districts and their local municipalities further the siloing between school and community resilience planning and building. Because of the localized control of schools, there are significant resource inequities between educational entities. As such, school leaders in under-resourced communities must span significantly more boundaries to make up the resource difference, including accessing technology, food, transportation, and more. Charles Lowry and colleagues have examined how school leaders bricolage or cobble together a patchwork of resources to respond to the opioid crisis in rural Appalachia. Ultimately, there's documented school staff and leader burnout, both in the direct response to crisis, but also the long-term recovery and sustained stress loads. When a school district like Northland in Alberta has to temporarily relocate every year due to wildfires, or another school experiences year after year of increasingly intense hurricanes, that instability affects the socio-emotional and psychological well-being of every member of that school community and the development of the students. When school leaders then regularly turn over, the long-term recovery of a community is ultimately hindered because those who were the boundary spanners are no longer there. But there are also strategies leaders can utilize to support successful boundary spanning. Successful boundary spanning is first based on both intra and inter-organizational trust. As such, school and community leaders must take the time to build that trust and social capacity. This may involve blending formal MOUs of crisis response collaboration with informal coalition building, such as cross-organizational working groups, exercises, and more. In order to avoid leader burnout, support systems for leaders must be built into organizational routines and practices. During Hurricane Harvey, school leaders were constantly checking in with their staff and families regarding evacuations, sheltering, flooding, insurance, healthcare, and more. But who was providing those same supports for the school leaders? Ultimately, without supportive practices and policies, boundary spanning remains fragile and personality dependent, especially for school crisis response. In the case of Pennsylvania, my work has documented how those leaders who self-identify as crisis experts organically build networks and systems to develop crisis preparedness and resilience. However, many of those who are assigned the school safety and security coordinator role are often neither not initially interested in crisis response or are already wearing many other hats. So policy and practice must better support each other. First, policy needs to recognize schools as resilience infrastructure, such as sheltering during hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis, and more. By being both physical and symbolic anchors in the communities, policy directly identifying schools as resilience infrastructure involves many following elements. One of which is, of course, increased funding. It's a necessary practice for deferred maintenance, to use schools as shelters, installing basic safety infrastructure like functioning door locks, and having a dedicated school liaison or crisis communicator role that's clearly defined. This role would ideally be directly involved with the local emergency planning efforts, along with exercising and supporting overall community resilience. In this way, policy and practice would both support each other and the boundary spanning work of leaders. As such, schools would then be tied into broader emergency planning efforts through formal policy and practices for this boundary spanning work. Using the US as an example, the separate policies between municipalities and districts can often hinder this work. One school leader told me he compared the number of educational acts and policies to a phone book. This means that integrating school systems into broader emergency planning cannot rest on policy alone, but also on reframing foundational practices of emergency management work like planning, resource management, ICS, and more, to explicitly involve schools while retaining the core purpose of schooling. And so in this way, policy and practice must work together better. In order to better examine school community resilience, we as scholars also need to develop a cohesive educational leadership with disaster science body of work. Currently, there are silo efforts in school psychology, criminal justice, and even public health. most of which is centered around school safety practices related to school violence, weapons in schools, and mass school shootings. While many of us have organically created opportunities to share and collaborate, our own siloing also needs institutional and financial support to overcome. As like many other nascent fields of work, we need to develop a set of rigorous and mixed methodologies for examining and evaluating school and community resilience practices, including rapid data collection and evaluation methods for before, during, and after a crisis occurs. Lastly, because of the nature of disaster scholarship, we need to utilize community-based approaches, including participatory and youth participatory action research, design-based implementation research, and research practice partnerships. These kinds of embedded research methods are growing in the field and point to long-term implementation and sustainability of findings. Furthermore, community-based practices support localized decision-making and trouble long-held assumptions in both the educational and emergency management research fields. In a conversation I recently had with a Nova Scotia school psychologist, she mentioned that schools shouldn't necessarily be the first resource for communities to use for sheltering. During flooding, fires, earthquakes, tsunamis, and more, like the Great East Japan earthquake, children experience the trauma of having their lives upended and losing family members. By being the first location they go to during and after the disaster, schools can become associated with that trauma, which the students then re-experience every time they come back to their school. However, of course, a school might be the only option in a community for large meetings or sheltering. By centering the voices and decisions of community makers in resilience practices, especially those who are most impacted by the effects of disaster, we can promote empathetic and just preparedness and resilience research that authentically attends to the local needs and affordances of that community. So much of what I have discussed has been about the boundary-spanning work of school leaders and from their perspective. However, boundary-spanning work is not unidirectional. As such, there are some implications for other community leaders like emergency managers in partnering with schools for crisis preparedness. In the same way that school leader boundary spanning focuses on developing shared goals, meanings, values, and norms, community leaders engage in the same work. From my own work in schools and research on school crises, I have several practical recommendations for community leaders looking to start these partnerships. The first is just getting to know the different schools in your community and their jurisdictions. What are the different school boards, private schools, charter schools, religious schools, and school-adjacent organizations like youth spaces, early childhood centers, and more in your area? Second, consider and get to know the legal framework of your school organizations. Like in the case of Pennsylvania, there may be a requirement of having someone designated as the safety coordinator or liaison. However, that person may be wearing multiple hats or may have little to no background in crisis work. Boundary spanning here, like the theory describes, requires developing a shared understanding of school crisis response as a part of whole community resilience. Similarly, there are likely state laws involved in what school crisis preparedness means, such as the number and kinds of drills schools must implement during the year. Just as in emergency management and crisis response, understanding the legal framework and research-based best practices are necessary for partnering with schools. Third, consider the calendar of the school organizations. When are the first and last days of school, holidays, etc.? Are there any professional development hours or in-service days? All of these will impact not only potential partnership meetings, but also implementing anything big, like a large-scale training or exercise. And lastly, lean into the expertise of school staff and leaders. The top-of-mind issue in the US for the foreseeable future will be school shootings as the primary school crisis. While active shooter and other mass threat exercises are beneficial for first responder agencies to practice, there is significant anecdotal evidence relating high-fidelity drills to negative outcomes to students and staff. Involving school staff and leaders in planning trainings and exercise will promote those events in being developmentally appropriate for students or determining if an event should be limited to adults only. There's a recent report by the National Academies summarizing the available research on school active shooter drills I would recommend that you read. To briefly summarize, theoretically, boundary spanning is productive for examining which fields of work are spanned during school crises and how school leaders broker those fields by considering goals and practices for crisis response, the orientations of leadership, and of course, relationships. Practically, boundary spanning is a core leadership function during and outside times of crisis that informs preemptively building those relationships, resource networks, and shared meetings across boundaries. The nature of schools' trust and access in communities make them anchors of holistic resilience despite the messy nature of overlapping jurisdictions between municipality and school governance. As such, the socio-relational and geopolitical context of boundary spanning work is important to examine and consider both as researchers and practitioners. I demonstrated this through the 4 examples of the US, New Zealand, Japan, and Canada during various community-wide crisis events. Lastly, relationships, preparation, and leader support as a part of boundary spanning work are key to cultivating holistic community resilience that includes the formal and informal school leadership. Thank you for your time today. In addition, I would like to take a minute to thank my advisor, Dr. Tana Vea at the University of Washington, my dissertation committee members, Drs. Marcia Modesti, Ty Hollett, and Heather Toomey Zimmerman at the Pennsylvania State University, and my mentors, Dr. Claire Connolly Knox at University of Central Florida and Dr. Samantha Biano at George Mason University. Lastly, I'd like to thank Dr. Jorge Wu and my colleagues here at the Building a Culture of Resilience Lab. All of them have played immeasurable roles in my work and developing this presentation. If you would like my full list of references, please contact me and feel free to drop any questions that you have in the chat and I'll be happy to answer them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dan. That was amazing. Maybe, first of all, big round of applause. So thank you. And we have a few interesting questions in the chat. Would you like to take them right away? Would you like to proceed, Jen?
Yeah, so I will, you've had a chance to look through them. I haven't had a chance to look through them at all.
Yeah,
so
I can read them out for the benefit of the audience, and then you can take them from there. So 2 are actually from Ray. Ray is our program chair, tenured associate professor in our Department of Emergency Disaster and Global Security Studies, and chair of our online Master of Science in Emergency Services program. So part 1, just curious, in your research, Ray says, is there any specific strategy we can use to fight against the wildfire, which is more frequent to see in these days? So wildfire, number 1. And then a second question is, or a second comment, I also believe that schools play an important role in disaster preparedness and response. In this case, any change, such as adding disaster response courses in Canada, to strengthen the students' abilities to prepare for and respond to disasters?
Thank you very much for both of those questions, Dr. Chang. So for the first one, in relation to like mitigating and fighting against wildfires, frankly, that's just not in the area of research that I have looked at too much. I've looked mostly at schools. And so in examining the ways in which schools have taken up either mitigation locally around their buildings, or as I talked about in the case of them collaborating and partnering with each other so that students do have a safe place to go and they know where they are going to go rather than suddenly having to be evacuated and having to figure it out. And because of the increasingly common nature of wildfires and mass wildfires, more of those kinds of school practices are becoming more of that reality. And unfortunately, that's also adding to, of course, as I talked about, leader burnout and stress. And so trying to figure out ways, and this kind of leads into your second question related to disaster response and preparation courses, of what are the ways in which we can build that in. And so I know that there are very small pockets of this trying to happen at the primary and intermediate and high school level, or the K-12 in the US. It's becoming more of a thing at colleges and universities of trying to do this response. And then some of the work that I have done in collaborating with both Penn State University and University of Pittsburgh and other places is how do we design courses for future educators and educational leaders to begin to think about these in their coursework as a part of, rather than a discrete separate entity to the things that they're already doing. is like, how do we interweave things around school safety, school crisis response, just within your day to day? Because it is something that we should be and do think about as we walk around the hallway and you notice evacuation exit signage of where are the stairs and that sort of thing. So to become a part of our culture rather than like, oh, suddenly it needs to happen.
Wonderful. Next question comes from Tamia Morgan, who is a STEM enrichment teacher in Baltimore, Maryland, and a management and leadership graduate student. Her question is, what low-cost practices build trust and connections across agencies, schools, and government before the next emergency?
That's a good question. Tamia? I apologize.
Yeah,
Tamia.
Tamia.
Thank you very much, Tamia. The best strategy that I have utilized in my work is first identifying who are the people and then picking up the phone to call them. I have found that people who are interested in emergencies and crisis response, myself included, want to talk to people about this. And they love to do that. And knowing that someone is interested, even peripherally related to your work as a STEM enrichment teacher, helps to build that relationship because you know that, and they know that there's somebody in the building that cares. The next thing as well is also talking to your school leadership. I'm presuming that you're in the school, and so you probably have some sort of school principal. And so talking to them about what are your practices and plans. From there, things unfortunately do get big and expensive, but having those initial conversations oftentimes helps to get the ball rolling. And by building that, say, hey, we have a shared interest in this thing, starts to develop that kernel of trust.
Thank you, Jen. And the next question is from Julia Hoban, who is an tenure track assistant professor, also in our Department of Emergency, Disaster, and Global Security Studies, and the chair of our online Master of Science in Human Security Resilience and also our online graduate certificate in Human Security Resilience. So Julia says, thank you for this great presentation. Echoes that. Can you share any examples where student voice or participation play a role in building resilience at the school or community level? Student voice and its role in building resilience at school or community level.
Yulia, thank you so much for that question. I alluded to it in the Grau-Vila article, and there's a lot of growing literature related to educational or disaster education programs that are involving more and more student voice. If you send me an email, I'm happy to forward you those references because it's definitely becoming much more of a thing in understanding, particularly in around natural hazards.
Perfect. And then we have Camille Leps, who is the senior director of instructional design here at so let me do that again. Camille Leps, who is the senior director of instructional design and development at Embry-Riddle Worldwide here, wonderful colleague, and a former middle school principal. In recent years, there has been a shift in perception about schools being a community hub in terms of trust and safety. How do we rebuild that trust in schools as a community hub?
That's a really hard one that's tied into a lot of the dynamics that have been going on. It starts a lot at the ground level, is that it's not that necessarily something that we can build even at a statewide level, but within counties of how does a family member feel and trust about their local school? So things like the COVID-19 pandemic, where we saw that happening in real time, where parents, students, family members were able to go to schools and pick up like the food distribution programs that were opened up before summer even happened, accessing technology, that sort of thing. Unfortunately, a lot of this comes into conflict with a lot of the school safety literature and practices of trying to lock down schools and keep them secure because of these external threats. And so by really cultivating these conversations locally at the community level, involving the various kinds of diverse family voices, organizational voices, and saying, what is the purpose of our school in our community, and how can we continue to engage into it as that community hub, as that community anchor? That is going to help to rebuild and cultivate that local trust, rather than just trying to start it at the state or national levels. Thank you so much, Alex.
Great. And as we're approaching the hour, I believe we have time for one last question, and that comes from Melissa Oster. And it is, do you have any ideas on maybe partnering with parents of school students to take some of the load off the school leaders by partnering with parents of school students?
That is a fabulous question, Melissa, and that is something that I have all of my eyes set to of really wanting to try to do because there are lots of different types of working groups that schools will put in, drop or develop, whether it be around technology or school safety and crisis planning. And that's how some of the formal ways that they involve parent voice. And so this is something that we don't know in the literature of how do these parents become involved? What are the ways in which their decisions are taken up in the literature? And it's an absolute area that I'm very excited to continue to explore.
Wonderful. So thank you, Jen, once again for an outstanding presentation. And I would like to also thank all colleagues on the call who have been supporting Jen in her studies and in this particular research. And I hope we can stay connected. And if you are interested in connecting with us, here are we being the Embry-Riddle Worldwide College of Arts and Sciences on LinkedIn. It's a great idea to follow us on LinkedIn if you're interested in, among other things, receiving announcements of recordings available. If we decide to make recordings available, if we have agreement, we can't always do that for certain reasons, but recordings from events and then also announcements of next events. So if you are interested in that, follow us on that way. Follow us on LinkedIn. And Jen, once again, this is so great. So great to see you again. Always good to stay connected with people from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And was one of the examples. It's interesting. We also have a colleague who does post-Fukushima longitudinal research. So you had a very captive audience here, and this really connects and builds networks. That's what resilience is all about, and what, in addition to the knowledge transfer, our series here, the Dean's Virtual Speaker Series, Resilience Reimagined, tries to foster as well. So with that, thanks all for coming. Thanks once again, Jen, for presenting. Great to see everybody. Hope to see you next time. Stay safe, be good, and we'll see you. You take care. Bye-bye.